All right. So thank you all for showing interest in this and coming back. For those of you who attend Shalom or who've been following our newsletter, you know that we are reading through the Bible. This past week, we read through Genesis chapters 3 through 11, and also a couple of other materials. And I just know for a fact that that material in the Bible in particular is prone to prompt a lot of questions. That these stories are challenging stories in a lot of ways. So before I say anything, maybe just give a chance for people to share any initial comments or thoughts or questions or concerns about the stories. You could do it either by typing in the chat something that you'd like to share, and I could read it, or I could invite you to speak. If you speak, be warned that your screen could show on a YouTube, your face might show on a YouTube video for a minute if you want to do that. You could send me a private message and I could read your comment anonymously, or a public message, or just unmute yourself. So at the very beginning here, Genesis 3 through 11, that's starting with the story in the Garden of Eden, with the fall, where the serpent appears and Adam and Eve fall all the way through the Tower of Babel story. So I know you've got them. What are your thoughts, questions, concerns for this material?
Well, in chapter 4, the interaction between Cain and Abel. In the RSV, okay, so each of them had different kinds of occupations, and each of them took the part of the proceeds of their work to God and as an offering. And God did not, it says in the RSV, God did not regard Cain, but he did regard Abel. Now, I have my understanding of God is different from many things that are expressed in the Hebrew scriptures. But how do we understand God liking what some people produce and not liking others? And that upset Cain, and he killed his brother.
Yeah, that's a tough question. Actually, Wilma preached on that passage not too long ago, and I listened to it again before preaching last week, and she entertained that question some too. I don't want to put you on the spot, Wilma, but if you have anything you want to add to that, since it's already up, you're welcome to.
Well, my thought is that what we see in the Bible are questions being raised that people have. And God, in this case, as a character in this story, is raising the question of unfairness in life, and why some people seem to feel that they are being treated unfairly. And what I think that God is saying to Cain is that you are going to feel that you have been treated unfairly from time to time. Everybody will experience this. The question is, how are you going to respond to it? Are you going to allow it to control you, your anger, your envy, or are you going to control it? And so God says to Cain, sin is knocking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. You must master it. You simply cannot get through life with everything going your way all the time.
Right.
So you have to learn how to deal with this. So I think these stories are setting up situations. That's what I'm saying.
But my problem is God as a source of unfairness.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, to just highlight both of those comments. I tend to think that a lot of the stories do that too. Another example would be the flood, which I'm anticipating that some of you pacifists had a problem with God killing everybody on Earth. All right, surely that struck somebody as being problematic, so I think that a story like that has a function where the moral of the story is, at the end of it, God decides, okay, I'm not going to ever kill anybody again. And that's a reassuring point, right? I can tell a similar story true story, about how with my daughter, my first child, I wasn't fully settled on where I stood about discipline and punishment, whether or not I believed in spanking or physical discipline. And there was a moment early on when she was about 2, maybe a little under 2, and she did something, and I decided to whack her hand for it. And the way that she looked at me was like a look of betrayal, and I didn't like how it felt for me to do that. It was hard for me to differentiate what was my anger versus what was a punishment. And so as a result of that experience, I made a vow that I would never do that again, that I would never use physical punishment again. And so from a human perspective, that's a reassuring point. Okay, now you know that he's never going to do it because he had this experience. But if you go beyond the moral of the story and you say, hang on, did this really happen? Like, it's one thing for Brian to whack his kid. It's another thing for a perfect, omniscient, all-loving God to make a mistake, especially on that scale. And so depending on what you're looking for Scripture to do, an answer like that could be very unsatisfying. So I tend to agree with Wilma in terms of like the point that the text is trying to make, but it doesn't undermine the point that you're making, Brad, that wait, but is God being unfair in the first place? Because that's still a problem, even if that's not the lesson of the story, if that makes sense.
I've given a little thought to this too. Whenever I read this, I struggle with that. What is it about? What's wrong with what Cain offers? Cain seems to offer a lovely offering, and it's not clear, why God prefers one over the other. And I just wonder. I always wonder if we are. To see in Cain, the way it's described is that Cain brings like some fruit, and Abel brings the firstling, which was always like, for the sacrifices, you were always supposed to bring the firstling of the flock and the pure of the flock. There seems to be an implication that Abel gives everything, the most of what the best of what he has to God, and Cain just gives some of what he has. That may not be, what's going on here, but when I look at that way of wording it, the only thing I can think is that we're sort of, there's an implication there that there's something about how much Abel is devoting to God in the sense of fully devoting himself, giving of himself, and Cain is not. God doesn't punish Cain until Cain acts out. But like Wilma, I think, it's more, there's also this sense that Cain is projecting the unfairness on God, as if Cain knows that he hasn't given everything he could give, that he hasn't given the best, and he's ashamed in some way. I don't know. Those are just things I kind of see in the text. Whether they're intended to be there, I don't know. But that helps, Brad. I don't know. That just kind of helps me sort of see another layer or level of what might be going on in that story that we're intended to see.
Hmm. Well, the way I would understand it at this point is that whoever wrote this part of Genesis did not have as complete an understanding of the nature of God as we have now, revealed through Jesus.
Sure. Yeah. These are all good comments, and there's many other things that I want to cover today. I want to give one more minute for, are there any other points that folks want to bring to light in terms of passages that really bugged you or struck you or anything along those lines? I did have somebody email a question about the meaning of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. I kind of touched on that some in my sermon today, but if there's more comments, we can get to them.
Can I just make 2 comments in relation to what Brad and Sabrina were saying?
Please, yeah.
First of all, Cain is the first one who ever gave an offering for anything. It was Cain's idea to give an offering to God in the story. So he was the first one. We don't have any laws yet. We don't have any priests yet. We don't have any set notions of what's desirable, what's not desirable. And the first thing of the firstlings, the first thing of the flock, is not necessarily the best. It's just the first one. And the idea behind giving the first is that you don't know if you're going to have any others. You might be giving the only one you have.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not necessarily the best, but it is the first. But we don't have anything that governs offerings yet at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, you can't tell a story unless you have something happening. I mean, you can't, you have to have something that creates a situation so that you can think about the issue that's there. So that's all I'll say.
Thank you. Yeah. No, that's good. And that's good. I'll use that as a kind of a way to segue into some of the conversation that I want to have about this text. I do want to warn that today's discussion, much like the topic of the fall itself, will be somewhat heavy. I'm hoping that as we get through some of these initial heavier conversations, it won't be as much. But if you haven't had a lot of exposure to different things, concepts of like biblical criticism and I don't mean criticism. When I say criticism in this sense, I don't mean like people like mocking the Bible or looking for errors. I mean, there's a discipline of evaluating scripture through a certain set of lenses called historical criticism or source criticism or redaction criticism or whatever. Anyway, this can be overwhelming when you first hear it. So that's why we're trying to go into it in a gentle way. But I wanted to peel back to these views that I was promoting early on and suggesting that there have been 2 primary ways that biblical scholars have, or that Bible readers, Bible experts, Christians have approached this for the past few centuries. There's one that might be called the liberal Protestant, but Catholics, there are liberal Catholics who do it too, method. And this is one that typically evaluates the text as if it were any other human document, and then uses various kinds of methods, like different ways of assessing the accuracy of history or looking for the agenda behind the text or these types of things to evaluate it. And then there is a more conservative approach, primarily promoted by evangelicals today, including Catholic evangelicals, which emphasizes inerrancy. It takes the text as being without error at its starting point. And I don't want to say that there's anything implicitly wrong with either of these perspectives. I think we have people in our church who are intelligent, God-fearing people who are inclined toward both of these directions. There are a number of us who have tried to carve out some middle space between those two. And I am one who tries to look at it through this kind of lens of divine intention. Like I do believe that there's something uniquely inspired about the scriptures that God has, or uniquely authoritative at least about the scriptures, that God has communicated special messages through them, but we have to do the work of differentiating what's the message of God and what's coming from the human packaging, which often contains errors. So, broad outline. So I want to talk about Genesis from kind of the liberal, the liberal perspective, liberal Protestant perspective first. I mentioned last week that most liberal scholars don't believe that Genesis was a single book that was written like by a single person, like Moses or anyone, but that it originally came from a number of different oral traditions, and somebody kind of brought them all together into one book. I gave an example of somebody in the early church period who did the same thing with the Gospels, right? They took the beginning of the Gospel of John, and then they put some of Luke on it, and then they went into Matthew, because they thought it was confusing to have these four different Gospels. So they tried to create a single document that brought it all together. Now, from this perspective, these stories that we have in Genesis 2 through 11 in particular consists largely of what you might call etiological myths, or a more familiar term for some of us might be just so stories, right? I don't know if you're familiar at all with the book by, I think, Kipling that came out a long time ago, Just So Stories, and it tells these cute little silly stories about how a leopard got its spots, or why a giraffe's neck is so tall, or something along those lines. Well, these kinds of stories that try to explain why things are the way they are a part of the majority of cultures around the world. And we find a number of comments in Genesis that seek to explain why things are just so. So, for example, at the end of the story in Genesis chapter 2, where you have the creation of Adam and Eve, there's this little line in verse 24 that says, "And that is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife to become one flesh." It's like the whole thing was a just so story, an etiological myth, trying to explain where the practice of marriage came from. And there are a number of these comments that say things like, that is why. That is why there's a saying that Nimrod is a mighty hunter, or that is why we call this part of the world Babel, because that's where God divided the language. And even when it doesn't use that phrase, you can see how this kind of thing might be operating. That is why childbirth is so hard. This explains why we rest on the seventh day. This explains why people speak different languages, right? Like, these stories are kind of trying to provide that function. Now, on the other end, conservatives take this to be not just these kinds of concocted stories, but a real description of history. There's different ways that this can be framed. Sometimes it's that it was given to Moses as a verbatim, God spoke these things to Moses, and Moses just wrote it down the way that God said it. Sometimes people frame it as being kind of like a family history, because the whole thing is paired with genealogies, right? So Adam told these things to his son Seth, and he told these things to his son, and his son, and sorry to leave out women, but they were left out in most of these genealogies, all the way down until somebody could write it down. And as a matter of fact, there are genealogies that go all the way from Adam to Christ. They don't all line up perfectly, but there are genealogies, and people have used that to construct those genealogies, because not only do they say who gave birth to whom, but they often include some kind of temporal marker, like Adam was 130 years old when he had Seth, and then Seth was however many years old when he had his son, and so on and so forth, until it gets all the way down to a historical event that you can mark. So people use these to kind of reconstruct history. And again, this usually uses the inerrancy of Scripture as a starting point. Like, we believe that Scripture is inspired, and people who say this would argue that just because there's a just so saying in it, that doesn't nullify the historical value of these things. The just so comment is explaining why something is so, right? So those are kind of the different perspectives. And I would say that if you're familiar with the Creation Museum, maybe you've heard of this. This is a museum in Kentucky, put together by a group called Answers in Genesis, or their close partner, the Ark Encounter, which is a reconstruction of Noah's Ark according to the dimensions in the book of Genesis. This is an entire museum that is dedicated to defending, arguing for the historicity. That's a fancy word to say the historical factuality, that when we say it's truth, we mean that it actually happened as it's described, the historicity of those events, right? This is kind of a tricky thing to sort through. It's tricky to sort through this, because in my experience, I think that evangelicals tend to go a little bit overboard sometimes in being so defensive of saying that something, no, this really happened, this is real, this is undeniable, that sometimes they make claims that just don't even make sense to me. But I think on the other hand, I find that sometimes the liberal Protestant perspective on things, it doesn't give the Bible enough credit. Like, it doesn't doesn't give it the benefit of the doubt in the way that I would at least give the Bible the benefit of the doubt on a number of different issues. And so finding a way to navigate between these is tricky. I've talked for a while there, so let me just pause and say, well, let me tell you what's coming next, but then I'll pause and say give you a chance to give feedback to that. What I want to do is next is kind of think about points where the evangelical or the conservative and liberal views clash, and how we might wrestle with those points. So what I'm going to offer is I'm going to try to offer some kind of a time, like a basic timeline, according to a very literal interpretation of the world, of when the world was created, when there was a flood, when all of these different things happened. And then I want to talk about, from a more liberal perspective, where in that timeline liberals start saying, okay, these things really happened, or these things are have some historical basis, and where in that timeline there's a bigger divergence and people say, no, I don't think this is right at all. So before I do that, does anybody want to make any comments about this whole dichotomy between two views that I'm presenting? Okay, well, feel free to unmute yourself and comment as we go here. I'm not locked into this. So let me just, this is not a very fancy PowerPoint. It's just.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear, yes. That sounds like Dan.
Okay. In my home congregation, which was on that far one side, all of the members kissed each other when they met on Sunday. The men would kiss the men, the women would kiss the women. If there was a visitor from afar, they would not be kissed because one didn't know. Now, why did they do this? It's because Paul said that we should do that.
Yeah.
Greet one another with a holy kiss.
Right. Great. Yeah. Thanks. I think there are very few, that's often the example that I use of a passage that congregations that think they're taking the Bible literally don't follow. That's pretty extreme for even those greet one another with a holy kiss passages. But yes, you're right, Dan. I think that there are some churches that believe that honoring scriptural authority means taking everything that it says at face value, and that it is disrespectful of Scripture to either not obey it in the most literal way, or to question the literal historicity of the events. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
This is Jean. My grandfather used to compare that holy kiss with the Church of the Brethren, the foot washing, to when he went away to college and his father told him to burn the midnight oil. When electricity came along, you weren't burning oil at midnight, but the point was to study.
Yeah. No, I think there's a valid pushback. I mean, there is a saying that makes a lot of sense to me that says taking the Bible seriously doesn't necessarily mean taking it literally, right? That sometimes you have to, especially since this was a document written so long ago, do a little bit of thinking about what the point it was making and how that applies. But I want to be clear that there's no clear there's no clear method that anybody can follow that can say, oh, okay, as long as I follow this formula, this is me taking the Bible in context, and this is taking it out of context. It's a kind of subjective process of deciding, when the Bible said, or if your dad said, don't burn the midnight oil, is his concern really not to stay up too late, or was he actually concerned about not wasting oil? Like there's going to be this debate always about what that means. So I wanted to offer this kind of, sorry, I'm struggling here with my technology. But I wanted to offer this kind of timeline. This is, I said via James Ussher, but that's not completely accurate anymore. James Ussher was an Irish archbishop who made an effort in the modern times to go through the Bible's genealogies and create a literal timeline of when everything happened. And so, like I said, he used those genealogies and a few other techniques to get figures similar to this. It has since been updated by more recent biblical literalists. But according to that timeline, the world would have been created around 4246 BC. Then around 2600, that's when the flood occurred. You'll notice that's a pretty big gap there, but Abraham and his descendants are all living in the multi-hundreds of years, so it takes a few generations to get from Abraham to the flood. Then around 2100 BC, you have Abraham heeding this call to go into Canaan. Exodus, the Jews would be leaving Exodus, leaving Egypt around 1577. David is anointed king of Israel, 1055. 586 is the destruction of the temple. 4 BC is the birth of Christ, death and resurrection of Christ. Okay, so this would be based on a literal interpretation of Scripture, a timeline for everything that's happened, all the big stuff. Now, I would say that from a from a historical perspective, there are a few tools that you can use to evaluate things. And Wilma is welcome to correct me if I'm getting it wrong here, but I think that the earliest figure in the Bible for whom there is outside archaeological verifiable information that that person even existed is King David. There we have found through archaeological remains of other surrounding places, maybe one or two references to King David. That doesn't mean that nobody else existed prior to David, but depending on how you're looking at it, if you're looking at it from a point of skepticism where you don't think that they existed until you see evidence from it, or if you're looking at it from the other perspective that you think they existed until you see evidence against it, David is the starting point. David is where you get this first glimpse that, okay, this person actually existed. Now, in some cases that we wouldn't expect there to be a lot of evidence that somebody existed. So like Abraham, for example, Abraham was a person who had a family but kind of wandered around in the land of Canaan. And if Abraham existed, he probably wouldn't have left a big archaeological footprint, if you will. So there's no real way to verify or deny whether someone like Abraham existed. On the other hand, when you're talking about Moses leading the people of Israel, this huge group of people through the wilderness, and they're crossing different towns and having these encounters, you would expect to be able to find archaeological evidence of something like that. And up to this point, there's not much, to be honest with you, archaeological evidence that a huge camp like the one described in Exodus was wandering around in those regions. Now, I want to make a further clarification here that that just because you have evidence that somebody exists does not mean that everything that the biblical story says about them is perceived by everyone to then be accurate from there on out. So a lot of scholars think that yes, there was a David, that he was a figure, but the biblical narratives oversell how powerful his kingdom was, that he wasn't necessarily able to unite the entire 12 tribes into one kingdom in the way that the text suggests. Maybe he mostly just had power over the southern two tribes. So there are different ways to, there's different degrees even within that. So archaeology is one tool that you can use. There are some cases where archaeology really makes some pretty strong corroborations of aspects of the biblical story. An example of this would be with King Hezekiah. King Hezekiah is attacked by an Assyrian king named Sennacherib in a story told from the Bible. And in the Bible's telling of it, they're completely surrounded. They're helpless in the face of this powerful army. And then God mysteriously intervenes in the middle of the night, sending an angel to fight on their behalf, and they disappear. Well, we actually have an Assyrian record of the same event. Now, bear in mind that Assyrians people don't generally advertise their failures, or if they do, they try to sell them as wins, as victories. And so when they made a stela of this event, the king of Assyria was talking about how he went around and destroyed or conquered various kings. And he says of Hezekiah that he caged him up like a bird, but that's all he does, as though he had a siege around him, but then he wasn't able to conquer or finish the job or anything else. So you have kind of some corroboration there. So you've got, in some cases, these kinds of archaeological pieces of evidence, but there's another sense in which we also have historical proximity. Are people writing about something that happened hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, or are they writing something that happened within their lifetimes, right? And so when you get to the stories of Jesus, this is on much stronger footing than even the stuff that you have in about David or the Babylonian conquest, because most of it is being written within a generation of Jesus's life. So even if the people who were writing weren't firsthand eyewitnesses, there were still people alive who could have spoken to whether those things happened or not when they were being written, if that makes sense. So as you go through the Bible, there's this kind of tiered degree of how much you can verify it. Again, if you take inerrancy as a starting point, you don't need that verification. But as we go throughout this series, I want to be kind of wrestling with the question, and with the questions that are often in the back of our minds is, did these things really happen? Now, feel free to jump in here, but I'm just going to say where I stand on some of this. From my perspective, and I'll kind of need to get out of this screen share here. So from my perspective, the earliest figure that has some basis in real history is Abraham. I think that there's I'm inclined to believe that there was a figure named Abraham, that there was a real person named Abraham. I don't know how much we can know about that person, but I tend to think that Abraham probably existed. So that means that I do not believe that the events described in Genesis 2 through 11 literally happened. And so I'm less troubled by some of the descriptions of God and things in that scripture, because I don't think that God actually said that God wasn't happy with Cain's sacrifice, or that God was so mad at the people of the earth that he wanted to kill him, or any of those things. Now that's a tough thing to hear me say, but I think the reason I would say that is there's a few points that I would make about that. I still find these stories to be authoritative, and I still trust the Bible. And the reason that I would make comments like that is because one, I think you have to look at the function of different kinds of scriptures, and ask a critical question of how important is it that these literally happen. And I'd give an analogy with a sermon. Okay, now I don't know if this is going to be helpful or if it's going to make you trust me even less, but for what it's worth, here it goes. So whenever I am preaching on Sunday mornings, I'm careful in some areas of my preaching to be very accurate in what I say, and in others I'm not so careful. All right. So when I use an analogy, a story from my life, or somebody I know, I am not afraid to toy around with some of the details to make the story fit the analogy a little better, right? So this morning I made some reference to a time that I had taken a computer in to get it looked at, and that was loosely based on 2 or 3 experiences that I've had with computers and whatever. It wasn't completely made up, but I was okay with bending the story a little bit in order to make the point that I wanted to make in that story. Now, by contrast, if I'm using like a quote or something from a theologian or something along those lines, then I'm not going to change any of the details. I'm not going to say something that's false, but often for the sake of time, I'll use the little ... ellipses to kind of highlight the part of the quote that I want you to see, or to make to bring attention to a certain part of it. Whereas if you were doing a really careful reading, then you should probably read the whole thing and say, okay, because sometimes the ... dots can be misleading. I try not to be misleading, but there is even a certain degree of manipulation with that, right? If I'm making a main central point, one of the main points of the sermon, like I was this morning in my sermon trying to make with regards to how the Bible deals with evil, I try to be very, very upfront and truthful. I try to acknowledge, what's coming from me, what's coming from the text, what some different perspectives are. I try to be as truthful and transparent as I can because I think that that's important. And I kind of view the Bible as doing the same thing. I think that when it comes to something like the resurrection of Jesus, it matters a lot if that literally happened or not. Or to a certain extent with something like the covenant with Abraham. It matters whether God actually made a covenant with Abraham or not. Because if that didn't actually happen, if there was no covenant, then what is the basis of this trusting relationship? On the other hand, whether God actually confused the languages of the people at Babel or not, in my mind, that doesn't have quite the same impact, right? There's a part of me that uses kind of literary analysis of text to make these judgments. I think most people who do a literary analysis of Genesis would agree that the main story starts with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And so I've been framing in my sermons Genesis chapter 1 through 11 as the backstory, because I think that that's how it functions. And generally, the points that are in the background are less important than the points that are in the foreground. To kind of verify Wilma's comment earlier, I think that the point of the Cain and Abel story, the intention, the focus was to look at Abel's, Cain's wrestling with his sense of being treated unfairly. And in my mind, that emphasis being at the forefront of the story is closer to what the divine message that God wanted to communicate to us. And so it's important to get that right. In the background of that story, in order to set it up, you have kind of a troubling way that God interacts. And I'm less concerned about that, if that makes sense. And I think I just say one more thing about with the stories in Genesis 1 through 11 in particular. I think even the text itself almost gives hints that this is kind of a abstraction meant to be a metaphor for history. I mean, the names of the figures, Adam means dirt and Eve means living. And so you have living dirt being the mother and father of humanity, right? This is kind of a metaphorical way of speaking. Or if you get into the story of Noah and his children, the descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth are the names of nations, Put and Canaan, and these different places that people could actually identify on a map. And so the way that I perceive it is that these stories might be comparable to what modern philosophers did with a concept called the state of nature, right? So when our current a lot of the United States government is based on a philosophy of someone named John Locke, an Enlightenment philosopher, and he was trying to think about politics in a fundamentally different way. He didn't believe in kings and queens and this kind of monarchical system that existed for millennia, and he was trying to envision something different. So what did he do? He invented a story about creation. He probably wouldn't appreciate me framing it this way, but he says that, in the state of nature, in the way that people were before there were any rules, before anything else, humans were able to interact with each other on the basis only of reason, and they wouldn't kill because they wouldn't want to be killed, and they would do these things because they were fair. And the whole concept of rights comes out of this theoretical reconstruction of the past. And I think that that's what the Bible is doing. It's offering a theoretical reconstruction of a past that is beyond our reach. And it's saying, let us imagine that this is how, for example, let's say that this is how the first humans sinned, and this is how these other things happened. And I take that to be an authoritative reconstruction. I believe that it's inspired. I trust the stories that it tells, even though I don't personally take Genesis 3 through 11 to be literal history. Okay, that was a lot, and that was kind of heavy. So I want to give you all a chance to respond, challenge, ask questions. Remember, you could still push back on either side. You could say, on the one hand, I believe in inerrancy as a starting point, and I don't really have a response to that. If you believe in inerrancy, like these texts are meant to be inerrant, then that's not an unintelligent view. If, on the other hand, you think that no, I think that you're stretching too much to try to make these more special than they are, and when I look at these texts, nothing jumps out to me as them being specially inspired. Well, I'm not going to criticize you for having that view either, if it makes sense. So anyway, let me give you a chance to respond to those comments.
I have a question that I'm going to direct more to Sabrina. Brian, you talked about how Christians have been wrestling with these things for a long time, but when we're talking about the Hebrew Bible, Jews have wrestled with them longer than Christians have wrestled with them. And I often find it interesting to look at other perspectives. So, rabbinic perspectives on certain passages, or sometimes the readings of people from Latin America who are reading from a very different social, it isn't just like there's two options. You can read it like a conservative North American or like a liberal North American. There are other options around the world. There are different ways to view this. And I guess I wonder, Sabrina, if you could, if you could speak to this divide that Brian is portraying with some rabbinic wisdom.
Well, not being a rabbi, I'm not sure I have rabbinic wisdom to share, but I appreciate what you're saying about the variety of perspectives. So much of what we get from the Bible or see in the Bible is colored by our experience, our cultural experience, our gender experience, all this history of our lives, where we are in the world, all those things. And even when we talk about, the various types of criticisms of the Bible, we have to make sure that we're expanding what scholarship we're looking at too, whether it's all coming from male scholars from the Western North, America, or, how far and wide we're looking. But the interesting thing for me, coming from the Jewish, having been raised with the Jewish perspective, is that I've always looked at the Bible sort of like from the backstory forward instead of from the end story back, or whatever, you would call it. I sometimes take issue with the idea that the God that you see in Genesis is in some ways a different God than the God you see in the Gospels, because it's the same God. And I think it's so important when studying the Gospels and the New Testament to understand it in the context of all the Judaic teaching that came before it, because it pretty much explicates and deepens the understanding of what's already in the Jewish tradition and the Jewish understanding. And a lot of things are left out too. A lot of intertestament, writing is left out, which so much of that Jewish writing, like the wisdom writing and things like that, have affected what the Christian perspective gets. So I don't know, but because you have to think that Jews are dealing with only the prior, the first set of scriptures, and that's the God that, but it's the same God. So, and all of those characteristics, you still have to struggle. You still have to struggle with all of the ways that God is portrayed. And sometimes I find, I was not raised, there's that similar kind of dynamic going on among Jews, that you've got very fundamentalist Jews, and you've got, the sort of middle of the road ones, and then the very liberal and radical, and it's developed so much over time, and, affected by what's going on in history, modern thinking, and anyway, but those perspectives are very varied too, and sometimes I just practice a sort of an exercise of taking the Bible literally, as if it was inerrant. I think that can be a really good exercise for people who tend to be very liberal, and in looking at the Bible, because right, we might not say that what Genesis is saying, or what happened in the story of Cain and Abel actually happened in history, but things like that probably actually did happen, and what did people do with them, and these were all great stories to be telling, and sometimes I just read it as if it was literally true, and see, because I think then otherwise there's the temptation to not give it the full respect it deserves, and to really get the full meaning of what God is trying to communicate. So anyway, I don't know if that speaks to any of that.
I might jump onto that if that's okay, Martha. I know the question wasn't directed to me, probably because you're tired of hearing me talk. But I do, one comment that I want to say that has been very helpful for me from the Jewish tradition is this concept of midrash, okay? Now, as Sabrina mentioned, the Jewish tradition today is very, very varied, and honestly, I think that the polarization over the scientific historical accuracy of these questions is dominant, and it affects every culture that wrestles with it, Jews, Christians, whoever. But if you look at pre-modern ways of dealing with these kinds of issues, a common technique that Jewish people would do, that I think I actually heard Sabrina use in an earlier answer, is this concept of midrash. And midrash is that when you are telling a story from the Bible, the stories are always shorter than they could be. And you use commentary to fill in the gaps, right? So I was actually doing this with, I was using a Christian midrash this morning when I was talking about the story of the Adam and Eve eating the apple, or the fruit, the forbidden fruit from the tree. The story doesn't say this, but Irenaeus offers the midrash that, well, maybe the tree was God actually intended to have the tree play an important part in their development earlier on. And when they ate from the tree, then if they were ready for it, that could have been a very healthy, positive experience. The problem was that they did it out of turn. Now, the text doesn't actually say that, but it doesn't not say that. And sometimes when you add these additional layers of possibility, it can help take away from some of the problems in the text, right? And so this is, I think, one common technique. And I actually think that there's something that to be said about authoritative midrashes, that there are texts that taken in and of themselves are kind of problems for us as people of faith. But over time, these kind of creative ways of reading them have emerged and have become so popular that they kind of take on an authority as a part of the Bible's story. And I'll probably mention some of these as I go, but this is a this is something that's influenced me primarily through early Christian interpreters, but it's certainly something that came originally from the Jewish rabbinic tradition. Any
And
other? Yeah.
Thank you. As you said, it is a hard question. And for me, I try to focus on the simple way, which is not complicated. Yeah, because in my view, even though people can go back and read some old texts, we can't understand the view, the thinking of people 1,000 years ago. Even though we have the same text, we can't get the clear meaning people have of this text today.
Yeah.
For example, if we see our different denominations, for example, you will see a lot of evolvement, a lot of change from 200 years ago to now. There is something sometimes totally different in terms of understanding, in terms of practice. For example, if people, for example, 200 years ago, you spoke about aircraft, flight, is not possible. Even though God could give them the sense of this, that it will be, it should be very difficult to them to apprehend it. So today we are talking about internet. We are using Zoom today.
Yeah.
When you go to my village today, you talk about Zoom, nobody will understand. So 15 years ago, you talk about Zoom, people won't believe it. So for me, everything we have in the Bible, the simple way to keep its authority is not question too much. Because even though we try to understand clearly with our current view, probably we may be wrong because the perspective changes over the time. So now we are talking about many planets. We can go to other planet, Mars, and we see that there are a new sun today. People are talking about a lot of things today. So for me, today, what is simple and easy for me is to get everything like that as we have it. And we are also free to try to question, to understand, but it's just an exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah, just an exercise to be able to explain to each other our perspective, but it will be difficult to understand clearly what happened a few years ago, even in our own denomination. When we go back to today, totally different. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that. I think that's a very powerful explication of a more conservative view, and honestly, one of the stronger arguments of the conservative perspective. One thing that conservatives will say oftentimes is that, which I think is a valid point, is that people tend to judge scripture, assess the scripture based on these kind of outside disciplines that they assume are themselves inerrant or reliable, and maybe they're not. And to verify your point, I mean, there were times when historians took kind of a very skeptical approach about anything that was written by ancient peoples that didn't have immediate verification. So they would say, for example, that the Trojan War never happened, that it just was completely made up and concocted. But with subsequent research and study, they found, oh, you know what? There probably was actually something that we call a Trojan War. So we were wrong about that. And to reinforce the point, there was a time when liberal biblical scholars might have questioned whether David even existed or not. And then a couple of artifacts show up that say, oh, okay, maybe we were wrong about that. Maybe there was a David. So I mean, that's a fair point, and I appreciate you framing it. For me, there's this delicate line of saying how far can you go with that. But I think that is a legitimate view, and that's a different way of responding to tough questions. Is if you say, we're trusting this, that's our starting point. So what's the best way we can make sense of this without questioning it, or without questioning it too much, as you put. So
I wondered if I could say one more thing in
Yeah.
response to Martha, that I think probably something that maybe I shared with a lot of Christians growing up Jewish was the emphasis on everything that is rational, and the whole layer of mystical tradition was kind of missing from what was taught, whether it was kind of in the prayers and in the liturgy, but you never really understood what any of it meant, and never was really studied. Like I was reading recently this book, I was reading it in connection with the class that Brian was giving about the afterlife, and just about the Jewish understanding of the afterlife, and how it went from, no really biblical teaching about what happens at all after death other than just going down to Sheol, and then beliefs about bodily resurrection but not spiritual immortality, and then beliefs about spiritual immortality but not bodily resurrection, and kind of making a dichotomy. And depending on where we were in history, and whether thinking was more influenced by like the Enlightenment or modern thought, affected what was taught in the, a majority of the faith, and how people understood it. And then I'm learning that more recently, the mystical traditions are being brought back, and people are really looking at that. And I know as a Christian, I haven't been a Christian as long as any of you, but the whole mystical tradition is something that I've always been really drawn to, but it's really missing a lot in what I think many people were brought up. And I don't know if you know what I mean, but that was kind of like when you were talking about Midrash, there is something like, if to look at the Genesis story of Cain and Abel, and kind of the way I was talking about God looking at the heart of Cain, maybe that's not the important message, I don't know. But that's, that's a level or a layer of looking at that story and deriving power and meaning in God, in who God is, and how God is working in those lives that we don't usually consider. So that's just the whole liberal conservative dichotomy. There's also the sort of mystical rational and finding a way to bridge and bring those things together is, I think, gives us a more holistic way of reading the Bible.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sabrina, and everyone. I'm going to have to bring this meeting to a close from my own end, but you are welcome to hang on here and keep talking as much as possible, as long as you want. I'll just say thank you all. I know that this is heavy. This is hard stuff, because many of us have very deep associations, feelings about Scripture, and to have anybody, especially someone like a pastor, say things that sound like they're a threat to it is hard to hear. I, again, I'll just emphasize that one of my main purposes behind this is that I think it's important to have a space at church where we could talk honestly and freely about these things. Because if we don't, then our own church people, our own kids especially, are going to go off and hear them for the first time from much less sympathetic voices, and it can be pretty devastating. Anyway, thank you all for the time here, and if you want to talk to me afterwards, send me a message or even follow up privately, feel free. I think some of our future conversations will be a little bit lighter and more fun, but I think it is important to remember that we're coming at this from different places and to try to honor those different spaces as much as possible moving forward. So.
Brian, I just want to thank you again for doing this, because I think a lot of pastors don't share a lot of the education that they have gotten in their own study or in seminary. And in many congregations, all you get, or most of what you get from a pastor, is the messages on Sunday morning. And I like this format where you go beyond the kinds of things that that a sermon would focus on, and are really helping us to be better educated about the Bible, about our faith, and I really appreciate that.
Thanks. I appreciate it. What a nice note to end on.